No matter what stage you're at, or no matter what field you're from, stress when writing is incredibly common. And even the smartest, most hard-working students can find it incredibly stressful or even completely overwhelming. So why does this happen? Why is it so hard? Why do so many people struggle? Well, there are a few reasons. The first, and perhaps most obvious, is the sheer scale of the task. So for most people, it will be the longest thing that you've ever written. And for a lot of people, it will be the longest document you write in your entire life. And that long document, it comes with a huge amount of pressure. So the way that a PhD is examined, everything rests on that one document. So it's not like when you were an undergraduate where you could afford to screw up one exam and then your average grade would kind of, make up for it. So there's a huge amount of pressure on this enormous document. And also, of course, writing is quite a difficult, complicated skill, and even professional writers can struggle sometimes. But in addition to these kind of basic circumstances, you might also be writing in a second or third or even fourth language. You might be writing while you're still doing the research, so you don't quite know how it's going to pan out. Or you might have so much knowledge about your subject. You might have so much to say that you don't know where to start. And you might also have other unique circumstances that make it more difficult. So when you combine even just a few of these factors, it isn't really surprising that so many people find it so hard. But just because there are a lot of potential difficulties, that doesn't mean that overwhelming stress is inevitable. And just because a lot of people suffer through writing, that doesn't mean that we have to. So to illustrate this point, let's compare thesis writing to another difficult skill. For example, brain surgery. So brain surgery is obviously incredibly delicate and difficult work. It demands intense concentration, and in some circumstances, you might have to act very quickly with very little time for preparation, and the slightest mistake can have devastating consequences. But most brain surgeons are not so overwhelmed or so stressed that they can't do their job. It might be stressful, but they can manage the stress to stay calm under pressure and get the job done. And there's a really simple reason for this. So if you or I had to cut someone's head open, it would be absolutely terrifying. But brain surgeons are trained to do the job. So they've built up a range of skills, which mean that they recognize the kinds of problems that can arise and the complications that arise, and they have a range of solutions that they can adapt and apply quickly. And this is really the key to managing the stress of a difficult situation. It's just a matter of building up the skills. And all of that knowledge, all of the knowledge that brain surgeons have, is built upon generations of brain surgeons who've gone before. So people who have figured out the solutions to those common problems and the complications that arise, they then pass on that knowledge to the next generation. And so every subsequent generation then has a slightly higher level of skill. So the first person to do something finds it very difficult, but then what was once pioneering and incredibly risky work becomes standard practice. Now, I'd like to ask a quick question. So of all the people in the room, how many people have had any kind of formal training in writing? Zero. Literally zero. There was one kind of maybe, okay? So one kind of maybe out of 60, 70 people. We have this situation where even though there are tens of thousands of PhD students graduating every year, and every single one has to write a thesis in order to succeed, and nobody has any training in how to do it. There is no standard, consistent way of teaching academic writing. So the vast majority of students have to just figure it out on their own. So everybody is in that position where everything feels kind of risky, everything's kind of pioneering, everything's going into the unknown, instead of having a situation where generation by generation, the writing actually improves. So this means when you face any kind of difficulty in your writing, and you will inevitably face difficulties, you have no training to fall back on. You have no principles to guide you and no framework for figuring out what to do. And of course, it is possible to work it out on your own, and lots of people have done that. And basically, it's a process of facing the same kind of writing problems again and again, so you figure out common solutions to the kinds of problems that arise, so then you can recognize the problem when it comes up, and you have solutions that you've already worked through that you can adapt and apply to this new situation. And it gets a little bit faster and easier every single time. So good writers are basically just people who have spent enough time solving writing problems that they recognize the kind of problem that they're facing, and they have a range of solutions that they can adapt and apply quickly. So these people exist, but the problem is a lot of people who have this level of skill don't necessarily know how they're doing it, and don't necessarily know how to teach other people to do it. So they might recognize good writing when they see it, but they don't know how to help somebody get to that level. Or they might recognize that this is bad writing, but they don't know how to fix it. And so generation after generation just struggles and struggles and struggles. So for me, writing my thesis was one of the easiest parts of my entire PhD. So the research was really difficult, and once I had the results, it was just a matter of getting it all down on the page. And I wrote my entire thesis in just 3 months. I passed my viva with 0 corrections, and I actually enjoyed the process. So I then went on to do postdoctoral research, and I noticed that there were countless PhD students who were much better physicists than I was, but when it came to writing, they were terrified. So I figured that if I'd written well, and I'd written quickly, and I'd enjoyed the process, maybe there was something that I was doing that was different that could help other people. But, of course, I was in that same situation where I didn't know exactly what I was doing. I didn't know how to help people. So over the last 9 years, I've worked with more than 400 PhD students from all kinds of different backgrounds. And I can tell you that the problems that you face in writing, they are not unique. No matter what subject you study, the fundamental problems that you're trying to solve are exactly the same problems that everybody else faces. And there are common solutions to these common problems. So what I'm going to try to do over the next 30, 40 minutes or so is to share with you some of these common solutions to these common problems so that you can build up your skill, so that you recognize the situations that come up, and then you can apply some of these in your writing and write your thesis without going insane. So what are we trying to do at a basic level? So fundamentally, writing is all about taking the information and knowledge that you have in your head and putting it on the page in a way that somebody else can follow. But the problem is that writing is linear. So you have one page after another, you have one paragraph after another, you have one sentence after another. But the knowledge that you have in your head isn't stored in that nice, neat, linear order. It's more of a kind of tangled mess of interconnected ideas and insights. One of the first things that you have to do is figure out a way to take that tangled up mess and put it on the page in some kind of structure that somebody else can follow. So let's start with just the introduction. So a lot of people say that you should write the introduction last, but the introduction sets the context for everything else that you're going to do, and it also contains some useful principles that we can apply to other sections as well. And here's the structure that works for almost any project, regardless of the discipline. First, you describe a situation of some kind or an event. Next, you describe a problem or a question that arises from that situation. And then you can describe how others have approached that problem or question. You explain the need to approach it in a slightly different way or expand upon what has already been done, and then you say what you're going to do. And this works for, as I said, for almost any project. And I'll give an example. So let's say we have a situation where worldwide the number of PhD students is increasing. Okay? But there is also evidence of disproportionate levels of stress among PhD students. So we have a situation and then a problem that arises from it. Then we have some kind of response to that, how other people are approaching it. So while there have been a limited number of studies to date which have highlighted the scale of the problem and individual institutions have made efforts to provide better support, there's been little research into the effectiveness of different interventions. This research will do this. So you can adapt this to almost anything. So once you have this basic structure, you can then add details to it. So once you've got an idea of the flow, so we can expand upon some of these points. So instead of saying, the number of PhD students is increasing, you can say over the last 10 years, there's been a huge increase in the number of students enrolling in doctoral degree programs worldwide. You can back it up with some kind of statistics. So recent UN statistics estimate that. And then you can even say why this is happening, why governments are trying to increase the number of students. So you can say, while the increase in the numbers of doctoral students is seen globally, it's even more marked in developing nations such as. This is in part due to a concerted effort at government level to do something. And then going further, although increasing engagement in doctoral research has a number of benefits, recent evidence has shown evidence of disproportionate levels of stress among PhD students. So we have the same basic structure, but we're adding detail, we're hanging detail off that structure. Even though we're adding extra information, we don't need to change the underlying narrative. And what this does is it makes it so much easier to edit your writing than if you have no structure at all. So if you were to just sit down and write whatever comes to mind, which some people advise, then you have no links. So everything's just this tangled mess. So how do you know where you can move something? Because if you take one piece and move it somewhere else, what are you moving it relative to? You're moving it relative to all this tangled up mess. So it still doesn't work. But if you have a basic structure in place, it's like a scaffold that you can hang ideas on. And if you have a solid structure, solid scaffold, then you can take bits off and you can move them around, and the rest of the structure doesn't fall apart. Okay, so we can generalize this. Okay, so it's no good just giving you a format for the introduction. We need to generalize this and look at the underlying principle. So what we have is a cause or a stimulus to start with. So worldwide, the number of PhD students is increasing. So it's a situation, okay? From that situation, you get a problem or a question that arises from it. And then you have certain effects. So you have people responding to it, either in the real world with some kind of response or an academic response, investigating what's happening. And then you end up with partial answers and other consequences, which in turn leads to more problems or questions. And so you always want to be aware of whatever information you're presenting, how it fits into this kind of structure. Is it a new situation or a new event that you arrive at? Is it a problem or a question that arises from that? Or is it some other kind of effect? Okay, and we can apply this to any section of the thesis. Okay, now, if we take this further, so expanding upon the introduction, once you've set out the basic aim of what the thesis will do and what it's responding to, you might want to give some extra background information. And what a lot of people do is in this new section, they will repeat the aim of the thesis. So they will say, this thesis aims to. The previous section introduced some of the background and why this research is interesting. This section will present a detailed description of theory X. Theory X is defined by Simpson, and the reader at this point is basically going to sleep. Okay? So if you try something like this instead and describe a situation, so we've set up the context, we've set up what the research is trying to do, and then we set up a new situation. So until the late 1960s, it was widely believed that. So you have some situation that existed. And then it was only with the discovery in 1967 of something by somebody that. So we have some kind of change, some kind of response, some kind of new information. And then this led to, so we have an effect, the development of an entirely new theory of X based on the idea that, whatever it happens to be. So the theory instead of just defining it, instead of saying theory X is defined by this person as this, we have a reason why that theory exists. Okay, we have the theory as a response to this this discovery in 1967, or it could be a response to a problem with a pre-existing theory. So everything is placed in context. Everything is placed within a kind of the narrative structure. So moving on to literature reviews, because that's one of the areas that people struggle with the most. There are three key things that you need to know. First of all, you do not need to show how much you have read. So a lot of people, when they come to writing a literature review, they see it as kind of being like an undergraduate exam, where you have a syllabus, you have this massive information, and your job in the exam is to reproduce as much of that information as possible. And if you miss anything, you lose marks. In a literature review, that doesn't work, because you might have 10,000 or 20,000 papers on a particular subject. So it's inevitable that you'll miss things. So your job is not to worry about trying to show how much you've read, but rather to put together an interesting narrative, selecting the best and most relevant sources to support that narrative. Okay? So it's an important change in basic mindset in terms of the way that you approach it. Then in terms of how you frame the information that you do select, the easiest way to do it is to think of every single paper as a response to something, to either a problem or a question or a situation or a previous paper. And then you can set these within the context of a general situation of something that's happening within the literature. So instead of starting by just trying to summarize papers, we can start by describing a situation that's happening within the literature, within your academic field. So you can say something like, research into, insert subject here, has gained pace in recent years. So it's a situation that's occurring, especially since the development of new techniques allowing something. One of the main aims of this research has been to, so we're describing what's happening, and then you say this chapter will outline the most recent developments, key discoveries, and current state of the art. So we're setting the kind of the scope of what you're doing. Another example, so following the discovery of something, there has been some kind of activity. So following the discovery of this kind of phenomenon, this kind of effect, this kind of technique, there has been something. Or you can say this has led to a great deal of debate in the field. So again, we're describing things that have happened. So it's all about setting up this context. Okay. Another quick example. So while there's been some interest in something in academic literature since the early 20th century, a concerted research effort only began in earnest in the last decade. In that time, however, there have been remarkable breakthroughs in both our theoretical understanding and practical applications. So again, we're just describing something that's happening in the field, some kind of situation. Or you can divide the literature. You can make an observation of how the literature is divided. So if it can be divided into two broad categories, then you can have that as a starting point. Then, when you're describing individual papers, they fit into this context, and they're all responding to some problem which is just a part of this broader context that we're talking about. So a good example would be, how do we define or measure X? Okay. What happens is you start with this problem or question, and then one author proposes a solution. So you can say the first major attempt to study this or solve this was conducted by Smith, who developed this technique. And then that initial paper, it has some kind of effect. Maybe the idea gains influence in the field, or maybe it sparks a debate, or maybe it's widely adopted until something else better comes along. So then you have the problem or the question, you have a response to it, and then the literature that follows on from it responds to that in some way. Okay? So it might be that original technique is really good in some circumstances, but then it has some drawbacks, so then somebody else develops something else. So we create a narrative around these sources. Okay? So it's all about putting it into a structure rather than just focusing on the individual papers themselves. This is just another example, a variation on the same thing. If you can't identify one initial source that everyone else responds to, you could divide it into different approaches. So there are three main ways this is approached. The first and perhaps most widely used was proposed by this person. And then you have kind of a partial solution, which then other people kind of refine and respond to and approach in different ways. Okay. So again, just want to reiterate, you do not have to show how much you've read. If your narrative makes sense and it accurately reflects the trends and key events in the literature or in your field, it will be obvious that you've read a lot. So if you go in and your main aim is I want to show the examiner how much I've read, that's not interesting for the examiner. But if you put together a good structure and you select the best sources, the examiner will automatically be aware that you've read a lot and you understand what you're doing. Another part of this, as you're selecting what to include as part of your narrative, is to focus on your strengths, not what you think the examiner wants to see. So as a PhD student, you will always be aware more than anybody else of your own limitations. And that creates this natural worry about, what if I get found out on this particular thing? Or what if the examiner wants to see, this detailed explanation of this kind of theory, which I don't really know about? So then, because of that fear, a lot of people focus on trying to fill that gap in their writing. So then what you're doing is you're putting most of your effort and putting lots of extra words into an area that you don't really know about. So then if the examiner knows more about that subject and you're a little bit weak, then you're attracting criticism, you're attracting difficult questions. So one way of thinking about the writing in this sense is you're selecting your own syllabus. You're deciding your own syllabus. You're choosing the ground that you're going to defend. So it makes sense to set your ground, set the area that you're going to defend in your strongest areas. So if you write the things that you know the most about, you're bringing the examiner onto your strong ground instead of going onto theirs. Okay? So it may be that you know who your examiner is going to be, and you think, so I need to write all about what they know. They're not interested in that. They want to know what you're strong in, and you bring them onto your ground, and you can show them something that maybe they don't know. So this same idea of structuring information in terms of problems or questions or responses to situations or events, it also applies to writing about your methods. So you can think of every experimental or research method that you use as a response to a problem. So having set the aims of your thesis, you then have new problems to solve in order to answer your research questions. So you might need a way of measuring a particular variable. So that's a problem or a need that needs to be solved. So in order to solve A, we need a way of doing B. And then you have various different options. You might have various practical constraints. And then that becomes the starting point for then describing what you do. So I'm not going to spend more time on this, but we can come back to it in the Q&A. But really the key point is just that this idea of structure applies to everything. And once you get that idea, everything else becomes much, much easier. Okay, so once you have some idea of how to structure your ideas and put together these kinds of narratives, how do you actually put it together? What's the process? So I always advise starting with the introduction. This is a little bit controversial. Some people say that you should write the introduction last because it's only then that you know exactly what you're going to do. But then if you write the introduction last, where do you actually start? So I think if you start with the introduction, you don't need to think about where you're going to start. So you have this specific problem. How am I going to introduce the reader to this particular topic? Okay. And as we've seen, if you know how to structure your ideas, if you know how to structure an introduction, it's not that difficult to do. So if you focus on the start, your challenge is to get the reader interested, and it's a matter of staying with that problem until you find an appropriate solution. You find the situation or the context that you want to set up. And then the challenge is how to then move this forward. So if you start on page 1 with the introduction, and then you work in sequence, you work in the same sequence that the reader is going to read, then you always know where your focus needs to be. So you have this unbroken chain from the very beginning up to whatever you're writing now. And that's where your focus needs to be. And if you jump around, if you hit some kind of block here at this point, it's very, very tempting to just leave it and start writing about something else. And if you're focused on increasing the word count, if your focus is on productivity, that's kind of the natural thing to do. It's the obvious thing to do. But what then happens is you start writing about something else, you maybe get a little bit more momentum, but then you hit some other kind of block. And then what do? You start writing about something else. So all of those problems that stopped you in your tracks, suddenly you end up in a situation where you've run out of easy things to say, and all you're left with is all the difficult stuff that you left for later when you're under the most time pressure. And what's happened is because that's become your default response, you haven't developed the skill of solving those problems that have arisen. So it's absolutely crucial to spend time with those problems as they arise. So the challenge, if you're at this point, is how to link this idea that you've written to the next idea and the next one and the next one. It's all about narrowing your focus onto one problem at a time, considering your options, and then making a decision. And this forces you to deal with the problems that arise, but it's just one problem at a time. So instead of jumping around, you've got all your attention on one problem, and it becomes solvable. So when you're in this kind of situation, you have a number of options. So what you can do is, if you have this unbroken chain and then you have this idea that you want to put on the end of the chain, sometimes it's a matter of just finding the right words. It might be a difficult idea that you just have to play around with words until you find the right way of expressing it. But sometimes that doesn't work. And what you have to do is consider, is this idea even going in the right place? Does it belong here? Does it fit into this context, into this narrative that I'm trying to set up? So then what you can do is hold that idea back. Say, okay, I'm not going to put this here. And maybe try some other idea in its place. And often what you find is when you put something else in there, then it helps you to make that step forward. Okay, so just deciding not to include something at this point can be a solution to that block, but it's only possible if you slow down to think about it. Other times, what might happen is you realize that this idea, it's actually more fundamental. It's something that you need to say earlier in the process. So sometimes you need to go back and find a place to insert that particular idea in order to keep things moving. Okay. Sometimes it's a case of deleting the last thing you said because that's where the block comes from, because it's kind of a dead end. Okay, so you have these various different options. Now, sometimes you might hit a block where you just can't, find your way forwards, and you need to step away from it, but that should never be your first option. Okay, you always need to spend a little bit of time, give yourself the space to try to solve it. So the way I think of this process is a bit like digging a tunnel through a mountain. So you can go back over a section and reinforce it or insert something, but you can't jump forward. You have to find a solution to the problem that you're facing that helps you to make progress. It's not always easy to do because it means that you're in that uncomfortable state where things aren't necessarily moving. You have to slow down, relax, and give yourself time to solve that problem. So when I talk about this, people ask, well, what about perfectionism? Because this can be a real issue. I think that you need to think of perfectionism as being a scale. So on the one hand, you have total carelessness, where you just write as fast as you possibly can, you defer all thinking for later, and you abandon all problems as soon as they arise, and the only focus is on getting words down as quickly as possible. The natural consequence of this is that you give zero attention to detail, zero thought to the clarity of communication, and the writing is guaranteed to be rubbish. So you can end up in a situation where you've got tens of thousands of words, but none of it's actually finished, none of it's actually really any use. The other end of the scale, you have total perfectionism, where you have this kind of excessive revision or hesitation, and you feel like nothing you write is ever good enough. You have this fear of judgment, fear of what the examiner will say, and so nothing ever gets completed, nothing ever gets submitted. So the two extremes are obviously pretty bad, but it's not a question of total carelessness or total perfectionism. The solution to total perfectionism is not to just write as fast as you possibly can, but to adjust where you are on the scale. So you can find kind of a sweet spot where you're giving a bit of care and attention to your writing, but without overly worrying too much about the end result. And as you're writing, you can adjust where you are even within this range. So if you find that you're going way too slowly, that nothing's really happening, that you're overly worried, then you can go a little bit faster. You can set yourself the target of saying, okay, in the next hour, I'm going to write 150 words. So it's not going as fast as you possibly can, but it's taking the focus away from the perfectionism to this other goal. At other times, you can make yourself a little bit more perfectionist. So if you have a point where you're saying, for example, the aim of this thesis is, that's a point where it's really important to be accurate in what you're saying, because that determines what the examiner is going to judge. They judge you against the aims that you state. So at that point, it's really important to slow down and take a little bit more care. So you want to be operating somewhere here. So it's sort of leaning towards perfectionism. It's taking time and care, but without being so worried about it that you never actually do anything. Okay, so most problems are solvable if you slow down and give them time and focus. And this is where you develop your skill. So this model, it's the flow model by Csikszentmihalyi. It tells you how your level of skill in relation to the task affects your mental state. So on the x-axis here, we have skill level, so high skill or low. And then on the y-axis, we have the level of challenge. So if you have a very high level of skill in relation to the challenge, so it's kind of medium level of challenge, but high level of skill, then you feel in control of the process. So this will be where you have ideas that you know really well, things that you've spoken about before, things that you've written about before. You feel kind of in control of the process. It goes much faster. But if you have an area where maybe the difficulty is quite high, but your skill level is low. So this could be some idea where you're not entirely familiar with it, where you're not quite 100% sure about what this particular thing means, then you can feel anxiety. And possibly the most important state is this one here, where the difficulty level is high, but you have a medium level of skill. So you're almost good enough to solve the problem, right? So it's good, but it's very, very difficult to do so. It requires your full attention. Now, in this, as Csikszentmihalyi called it, this arousal state, this is where, if you put all of your attention and focus on that problem, and you work at it and work at it and work at it, and then you find a solution, this is where you improve. So this is where your skill level is pushed just beyond where it currently is, but not to the extent that it's overwhelming, right? So it's possible with your full attention. This is where you improve. So a lot of the time when you're writing, you will be in this very uncomfortable state where it's just beyond what you can do easily, but with your full attention, you can actually solve the problem, and then it speeds up again. So part of the writing process is accepting that discomfort, becoming okay with that discomfort, and not kind of getting distracted, not working on something else. The same thing applies, by the way, in your research. It's not just related to writing. This could be related to any kind of research or analytical skill as well. So it's being able to slow down, take time to think, and give yourself time and opportunity to solve that problem. Okay, so we're going to get into the Q&A pretty quickly because there's a lot of people here and I've covered a lot of ideas quite briefly. So there are all kinds of things that you can ask that I've just touched upon or not mentioned at all. But before we get to that, just want to kind of sum up a couple of key things. So as I've mentioned, if you slow down, you can develop the skill, and we're working towards this state where, having solved the problems that have arisen, you then recognize the kind of problems that arise next time. You get faster, and you have this range of solutions that you can adapt and apply quickly. This helps to build confidence, which is really crucial to being able to write quickly and write well. But skill is not the only factor. If you want to be confident, then you've got to consider the outcome and how that affects your mental state. So if you want to be certain of the end result, then you're never going to have confidence, because it's not like the undergraduate exam where you knew what the syllabus was and you knew that basically the answers to the questions in advance. So with a PhD, you cannot be certain of the end result, but what you can do is have confidence in your ability to cope with whatever happens. So if you're terribly worried about what the examiner will think, and that's taking up all of your attention, that's going to affect your ability to actually do the work that's necessary to pass. But if you accept that, hey, maybe it might not work out, maybe the examiner won't like my work, maybe there's something I've missed, but I'm going to accept that if that happens, however bad it is, I will cope with it. If I fail my PhD viva, then I'll have all these problems I'll have to deal with. I have to find a job. I'll have to explain to my family, all of these kind of things. But I can deal with it. I'll find a job somehow. I'll get through. It's not going to be the most important thing that happens in my life. So if you take that attitude when you're writing, I don't care what the examiner thinks. It frees you up to just focus on the ideas instead of thinking about what they will think of you. And that is where the confidence comes from, accepting that things might not work out the way you want, but giving it your best shot anyway. Okay, so we'll get into the Q&A. My name's James Hayton. Thank you very much. So, any questions? Okay, so first of all, I'd say there is no perfect solution. So if you can find an adequate solution that accurately reflects what you want to communicate, then that's good enough. So when you're facing one of these problems in your writing, you can think of it as kind of a problem of expression, which has multiple valid solutions. And what you're trying to do is put together something that helps you link to the next thing, leads you in the direction that you want to go. So often what happens with perfectionism is you're assessing your own writing, which is a good thing, but you don't know what's good enough, or you haven't decided what's good enough. And so you get kind of stuck in this loop where you don't make a decision, where you don't move forward. Sorry. So when you look at it, just say, well, does this accurately communicate the idea that's in my head? One way to force yourself to do that, as I said, is to give yourself a timed word count target. So you still want to communicate clearly. You still want to write well, but it's balanced against this other target. So if you say in the next hour I'm going to write 150 or 200 words, then if you aim for that target, then it stops you worrying quite so much about, is this exactly the right word to use in this particular case. So yeah, it's altering where you are on that perfectionism scale. I would never say, some people advise just write as fast as you can. I never advise that because you just end up with a mess. You increase the word count. If you do want to just get words down to give yourself something to work with, use pen and paper. So do a mind map, dump everything down, and you can select ideas. So yeah, just go a little bit faster with that timed word count target. Try that out, and it should help. Yeah, so I think it's good to have a daily target so that you can have an objective measure of whether it was a successful day or not. Okay. So when I was writing my own thesis, I had a target of 500 words a day as a minimum. And I knew that, if it was going well, that wouldn't take me very long at all. It might take me a couple of hours to write 500, reasonably okay words. So I set myself a target that I knew I could beat every single day. So some days I would write 2,000 words, a fantastic day. It's like, wow, I've smashed my target. Other days I might really struggle to reach that 500. So those days when I'm writing about, some aspects which I maybe don't know so well, but I work through until I reach that 500 target. And then if it's really difficult, you can break it down into smaller targets. So before lunch, I'm going to get 100 words. And then, so you've got this success to build upon. If you set the target as something that you can barely achieve, then most of the time you're not reaching that. And so you just feel bad. It might have been a really good day. You might have written, 900 words. It's like, I didn't meet my target. So you're going to be that little bit less motivated. So some people write faster than others. So if you're a native speaker, then probably it's going to be a little bit faster. If you have a bit more writing skill, if you've practiced it more, if you've just got whatever natural talent, you may be a little bit faster. So set a target that's appropriate for you. And you can work that out over a couple of days. If 500 is too much, you'll lower it to 300. Set a target that you can smash. So in terms of the depth that you go into, no matter what subject, no matter who it is, you should vary the amount of depth that you give on each individual idea. So you will have some areas where you're really, really, really strong. And generally speaking, those should be the areas where you say a little bit more. But in order to get to those points, maybe you need to mention some other areas which are not exactly your main strength. So what you can do is mention them relatively briefly, refer to other sources, and then that frees you up to give more space to the things which you're really interested in. So one example of this from my own thesis. So I was very, very much an experimentalist. So my maths for a physicist was pretty embarrassingly bad, but I was pretty good at the practical side. But in order to talk about the practical side, I needed some theory, right? The basic problem that I was working on, in order to explain it, I needed a little bit of theory. So what I did was had basically one paragraph that said something like, in 1928, this person came up with this theory for overcoming the diffraction limit, et cetera, et cetera. But then brought it very quickly to the practical side. So you had this theory in 1928, and then I think it was only in the 1950s that it was proven experimentally, but it was then in the 1980s with the discovery of scanning tunneling microscopy that this other thing became practical. So I covered that ground. So from 1928 to the early 80s, more than 50 years, in one paragraph, and then just focused on the practical stuff. Okay, so there's almost no depth to the theory at all. It was just this is the equation, this is the consequence, and then straight into the practical. So vary the amount of depth, and the guiding principle is say more about the things that you know more about, and do it that way. Sometimes you can give almost zero detail at all. So another example, the technique that I used, it also had applications in, say, biology. So all I did was say, this technique has found applications in a number of different fields, including biology and something else and something else. And for each one, I just had a quick reference. And all I was doing was naming the fields where it's been applied. No depth at all, but it sort of indicates that it makes the point that this has a lot of applications, and then bring it right back to the area that I was actually interested in. So don't lose time going into depth on areas that you don't know so much about. So if you're writing a literature review, for example, you need to have a base level of knowledge of what is happening in the field before you write anything. So what some people do is they take a stack of papers, first paper, and then they try to summarize it in one paragraph. Okay? But then you don't know how that paper fits into the context of everything else which is happening in your field. You don't know what role it's playing. So it doesn't quite fit into a narrative. And then it's very hard to edit that once you have all of those paragraphs. So you need to have, at the very minimum, enough knowledge to say, well, there is this general trend in the literature, and that could be there's a lot of debate about this subject, or there's a million different applications of this particular technique, or this is a long-standing problem in the field which has had all of these different approaches. You also need to know what are the kind of key influential papers within that field. Okay, so the highly cited things, you can broadly divide the literature into two categories. So you have the groundbreaking stuff that has a massive influence on the field. So if somebody invents something or discovers something new, that then triggers a whole load of other research by other people. Okay, so if you know who the groundbreaking people are, you can then set that up as kind of like an event. There was this discovery which then triggers other things. So then all of those following papers, they fit within the context of that initial discovery as a sort of consequence of that initial discovery. So you need to have kind of a broad picture of more or less what has been happening within the field. Okay. Which just comes from reading and a little bit of experience. Then what you can do is read specific papers to fill in some of the gaps as you're writing. So if you're putting together this narrative, so let's say you want to talk about the development of a particular technique, so you kind of know who made the big discoveries, you sort of know, what the different variations of that technique are. So then you can look at different papers for specific details to fill in some of those gaps. So it's not quite as simple as saying write as you're reading or do all the reading and then write. I would say do a lot of reading, and then as you're writing, refer back to the literature multiple times. On this point, I have seen some people say, I saw one person say, I only believe in ever reading an article once. And that was just, it kind of blew my mind because it made no sense whatsoever. And basically the idea being if you take good enough notes, then you never need to look at it again. But the thing is that different papers will be useful to you for different reasons at different times. So if you read something in your first year, you might not be ready for it. Or the thing that they say, maybe it isn't quite relevant to what you're working on at the moment. But then 2 or even 3 years later, maybe you remember, yeah, there was that paper that I read, or you stumble across it again, and then it becomes very, very relevant. So you'll constantly be kind of referring back to literature time and time again. That just never ever stops. But it all comes from having this sort of contextual knowledge of what is happening in the field, the sort of broad strokes thing, and then the individual papers kind of serve as examples of things that are happening. Okay, so the mind map, it's kind of I see it as sort of an intermediate step. So you've got this big tangled mess of ideas in your head, and then you ultimately want to put it in this linear fashion. So that's basically what I use. You can do it online. I prefer to do it with pen and paper. And then what you have is kind of a stock of ideas. It may be that you have too much for one sheet of paper, in which case you kind of try and focus in on one topic and then mind map around that particular topic. But then what you can have is sometimes an entire chapter's worth of ideas on one page. And it's very, very quick to look at that and review it and then pick out ideas. Or as you're writing, refer to it and say, oh yeah, I need to remember to put that particular thing in. The next intermediate step that you can do is just create some bullet points. So from that mind map, you can plan, okay, this is the basic problem that we're addressing. This was kind of the first major discovery. This was the consequence of that particular thing. The other intermediate step is that the mind mapping might expose some gaps in your knowledge. So you might think, I think there was that paper by this person, I can't remember who exactly it was or when it was. I need to double check that. So in addition to the bullet points for what you're actually going to put in, sometimes it can help you to identify things that you need to look up or other preparation work that you need to do as well. So basically go from mind map to bullet points, figure out where the gaps are, and then only then can you, I would suggest starting to write. And again, you can repeat that process multiple times. It's really quick and really easy. When you're at a relatively early stage of the PhD, you don't necessarily know what literature is going to be most relevant to you at the very end. So the literature review that you put together will almost certainly change by the time you get to your final year or when you're preparing to submit. So what you can do is take some of these difficulties that you have with the literature and turn them into useful observations about the state of the field. So if people are approaching this problem from all kinds of different angles, and maybe there are lots of contradictory theories, or maybe in some areas there's a total lack of literature, what you can do is instead of saying, in this area there's like 10,000 papers and in this area there's none, what do I do? Just make those into statements that you put in your literature review. So you can say, this problem has been approached from a multitude of different perspectives in different fields, including A and B and C and D. Okay. Then you can say one of the most influential approaches, or one of the most commonly used approaches, is this. Okay. And then you can explain, who the big thinkers are in that area. But then maybe there's a problem with that approach, okay? So, or it doesn't take account of some other aspect of behavior in your case. So then you can introduce another strand of research which addresses that problem. So again, we're trying to frame the information as a response to a problem. So we have one approach, which is used by some people, that's pretty good at some things, but less good at this. So in order to address that deficiency, we can approach it in this other way. So you can make these kind of these observations about the literature, and then figure out how to put it into this kind of structure where everything is a response to a particular problem or a need. And at the moment, honestly, I would say see it as just practice. This is not the final literature review that you're gonna do. Get an idea of the kinds of things that are happening. Get an idea of the key papers, and then as you go about your research, you will find some things which are absolute gold dust. You will find some papers that really influence the way you think, and then later on you can work those in. You can work those into the final version of the literature review. As a more sort of general point, when you look at the literature, in addition to different pieces of literature being useful to you at different times, some papers will be massively more useful to you than others. So if you have like a stack of 10,000 papers, maybe 10 of them actually influence the way that you think. And so you can sort of filter the literature according to its usefulness and relevance. So on the one hand, or at the top rather, you have sort of the A-rated papers. So these are things which have had a massive influence on your field or a massive influence on you, okay? So there maybe be sort of 10 or 12, possibly 20 of these, which you find throughout the course of your PhD. Then there will be some things which are sort of relevant. They provide some useful background information. It's good quality research. So there'll be more of these, but you'll say a little bit less about them in your literature review. And then you have even more papers which are possibly relevant, but you don't really see how they fit into the big picture. They don't have a big influence on the field. They don't directly influence your research. These are kind of the C-rated papers. And then you have the D-rated ones, which are either poor quality or just irrelevant, and there'll be thousands of these. So it's recognizing as you're going through the literature, oh, this one's really good, and you want to spend more time with those papers and in terms of understanding them, and also in the literature review as well, in terms of emphasizing those in your writing. So balancing the sort of reading and learning and basic stuff against getting the results. Okay, so I think that obviously the reading is really important, right? You need to know what has already been done, partly to provide context for your work, but also because a lot of the practical problems that you struggle with, they're already solved in the literature, so you can find useful information. But in order to fully understand the literature, you can't just read. You need practical experience as well. So this happens a little bit more in the social sciences, I think. But a lot of people spend too much time reading and trying to get a complete theoretical understanding before doing any practical work. And you have to be willing to just try doing some experiments and making mistakes and letting things go wrong, so that you gain a lot of that skill in order to get your results. So you mentioned in terms of getting results to show your supervisor. I think initially it's about getting the skill to get the results. Okay, so don't put yourself under pressure to have a result immediately. It's more about getting the basic techniques down. Learning, making mistakes, and then you'll find you get more results later. In my own case, in my own PhD, I made exactly this mistake. I was constantly frustrated by the lack of results, and when things went wrong, which they did pretty much constantly, I got kind of dispirited. But because the equipment that we were using, it was breaking down all the time. I could see Phil smiling at the back. He remembers it well. Because the equipment was breaking down all the time, and I was constantly having to solve these problems, what was happening was I was developing pretty good level of skill and understanding of how the equipment worked, but I wasn't getting results. And it was only in sort of towards the end of the third year that things started coming together. And once I had some results, I had the skill to kind of exploit them quickly. Okay, so focusing on getting the skill, allowing yourself to make mistakes rather than having results to show initially. The balance with reading, that will change throughout the course of the PhD. There'll be times when you're doing more practical stuff, times when you're reading more, but the reading never stops. You don't want to be too much focused on one or the other. So you don't want to be doing all practical stuff and no reading. You don't want to be doing all reading and no practical stuff. So vary it depending on what you're trying to do. Okay. Okay. So writing in a second language, this is extremely common. Because pretty much every PhD student, with some exceptions, but pretty much everybody worldwide has to write in English, because English is the language of academia. Okay, so that. What stage are you at? What year are you in?
I'm almost second year.
Almost second year. So you have time. So it's not a surprise to you that in 2 or 3 years you have to submit a thesis in English. So what you can do is work on that basic skill. So work on your written English, and the best thing to do is get a tutor, right, who can work through with you. So see your common mistakes and correct those. If you leave it another year or 2 years, it gets harder and harder and harder because you're under more time pressure. You can't, and you'll have other things to do. So I would say start now. Start taking those English lessons. There are plenty of English tutors around. Find one who can help you specifically with writing, and it's just another skill that you can add. It's coming up, so you know that it's a point of stress. So start working on it. I think it's better to refer to it multiple times than to try to say everything about a paper, the first time you mention it. So as I said, different papers will be useful to you at different times, and sometimes the same paper will be useful to you in different ways at different points throughout the thesis. So maybe initially you can set it up. If you're giving a bit of background about your field, you can mention that paper and say, one of the most influential papers regarding this subject is the paper by whoever, and give a quick overview of what they said. And then later, when you're perhaps presenting your results, you can say this is similar to the results observed by that person. Whatever it happens to be. That's absolutely fine. You can refer to the same ones multiple times. So the short answer is that writer's block doesn't exist. And the reason why I say that is that there is no single thing that is writer's block. It's an effect that has multiple different causes. Okay? So if you think of just solving writer's block in terms of I'm not producing enough words or no words at all, then the obvious solution is just, write more words, right? But instead, you have to look at the underlying cause, why you're struggling to find those words. So it could be simply that it's a difficult idea that you're trying to express. So it's just a matter of taking the time to, first of all, fully understand the idea, to make sure that you know what you want to say about it and how it fits into the context. So that's one kind of problem, which is basically, just spend a little bit more time with it, think about it. Don't take the pressure off in terms of writing words. Writer's block could also come because you're tired, right? So if you've been writing all day and you just kind of end up at this point where you just can't think straight, then the solution is not to carry on working or to slow down. It's just to take a break. It could also come because of fear. So it could be that you're really worried about what your supervisor will say about a particular thing, in which case it's just working on that confidence of saying, well, okay, I don't know what my supervisor is going to think, but I'm going to give it my best shot anyway. There are all kinds of different things. So you've got to figure out what is it that's actually causing the writer's block, and then address that. Okay, so figuring out what you're feeling. It could be, as it came up in a different question, it could be perfectionism, in which case setting that sort of timed word count target is a good thing to do. It could be that you need to do some other preparation work. So you need to complete your analysis or double check your analysis or look something up, whatever it happens to be. So don't think of it in terms of writer's block, but think of writer's block as a symptom of some other underlying thing. Then if you can identify that, then you can find a solution. There's two aspects of it. One is organizing your time in terms of what you decide to read at a particular time. The other aspect is how you organize the literature itself and the copies of the papers that you have. In terms of organizing the copies of the papers that you have, the way that I did it, or the way that I eventually did it, was I had this huge stack of paper on my desk that was completely disorganized. I also had a bunch of stuff stored electronically. And basically what I did was I took this stack of papers and I sorted them into folders by subtopic. So I had ring binders So everything on hydrogen termination of silicon surfaces, for example, was in one folder. So I could then just reach out and grab it, and I had everything on that topic in one place. There were some papers which spanned multiple topics, so I just had more than one copy, or I had a note in there saying, see also this one in this folder. If you have physical copies, then what you can do is you can highlight important papers by just drawing a star on the front. So as you scan through, it's really easy to find. And also any notes or anything that you want to highlight, you keep it in context with all of the information. So instead of taking separate notes, like in an Excel spreadsheet or something, where you're extracting the information from its context, instead you keep everything and you just highlight the important parts that you want to remember. Okay, so if you organize it into physical folders, you can do the same thing digitally, but I think physical is better if you have that option. In terms of organizing your time, in terms of around reading, it depends what you're trying to do at any given point. So if you're embarking on some new kind of sub-project or some new branch of research, then a lot of it will be focused around getting to grips with basic principles or basic techniques. Then you have to identify the papers that will help you to do that. The difficulty is that most papers are not written to teach. They're written with the assumption that you're already kind of expert. So sometimes what you have to do is you find a paper, you identify the kinds of ideas that that paper or lots of papers are talking about, and then you go somewhere else for an explanation. Sometimes going to Wikipedia is really good. Wikipedia is fantastic for academic subjects because the only people who will write 10,000 words on some obscure statistical technique are nerdy academics who are obsessed with that particular topic. So sometimes Wikipedia is way better than any individual paper, sometimes. Or you have to look at a textbook or just ask somebody. Other times you'll be looking for specific results. So you're looking at papers for those kind of things to compare your results to, or just to see what's been done. Sometimes you're just trying to get an overview of the kinds of things that are happening. In which case, focusing on pre-existing literature reviews is the best way to do it. But it really depends on what you're trying to do at any particular time. And whenever you're looking at the literature, having that idea in mind, what are you looking for, is really, really helpful. Otherwise, you just get lost in this massive paper. Okay, so I think that's about all we've got time for. So that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.